Sandra arrived at the hospital every morning at exactly 6:47, not 6:45, not 6:50. The other nurses noticed it, but never said anything. She would hang her coat on the third hook by the door, tie her hair back in the same simple knot, and walk to the supply room to check what was needed before her shift officially began. She was not unfriendly. She smiled when someone spoke to her. She remembered birthdays. She brought food to the break room on Fridays. But she never talked about herself. If someone asked where she grew up, she gave a short answer and turned the conversation back to them. If someone asked about her past, she would say something like, "Oh, it's not very interesting," and somehow the other person always believed her. She had been at the clinic for 3 years. In that time, she had become the nurse that every doctor quietly hoped was on their floor. She could read a patient's condition before the monitors told her anything. She could start a difficult IV on the first try, even when every other nurse had failed. She kept calm when the room was loud, and the patient was frightened, and the machine was alarming, and the doctor was giving 3 instructions at once. Nobody knew she had learned all of this in a place far more difficult than any hospital. The other nurses liked her, the doctors respected her, the patients remembered her, but nobody truly knew her, and she preferred it that way. On a cool Tuesday in October, that all changed. It started just after 9 in the morning. Sandra was on the first floor, changing a dressing on an elderly man's arm wound, when she heard shouting from the hallway. She looked toward the door. The shouting got louder. Then came the sound of something heavy falling over. Then the sound of people running. She stepped into the hallway just in time to see a man in a gray jacket, waving a firearm and screaming at people to get back. Security tried to approach him. He fired once at the ceiling. Everyone dropped or ran. Sandra stepped back into the room. She looked at the elderly patient, whose face had gone white with fear. "Stay down and stay quiet," she said, in a voice that was somehow both calm and completely serious. She pulled the privacy curtain closed around his bed and moved toward the door. Through the narrow glass panel, she could see the man in the gray jacket forcing people toward the administrative wing at the far end of the first floor. He was pushing them into a large office suite and slamming the door behind them. She counted the people going in. 8. Then the door closed. Then she heard the lock turn. She looked around the hallway. Everyone else on the floor had either run or was hiding. She was alone. She thought for 1 second, then walked toward the administrative wing. She knocked on the locked door with 3 soft knocks. "I'm a nurse," she said quietly. "I have supplies. Let me in." There was a long pause, then the door opened just enough for her to squeeze through, and then it was locked again behind her. Inside, 8 people sat on the floor with their backs against the far wall. A billing clerk named Rosa, 2 hospital administrators, a janitor named George, an elderly visitor who had come to see her daughter after surgery, 2 young nurses, both less than a year out of school, and a security guard named Marcus, who was sitting with his right hand pressed hard against his thigh, blood soaking through his pants. The man in the gray jacket was pacing near the window. He was not calm. His hands were shaking. His eyes were moving fast. He had a list of demands he kept reading from his phone, but the words came out in the wrong order, and he kept starting over. Sandra took one look at Marcus and moved toward him without asking permission from anyone. "Let me see," she said to him. He moved his hand. The wound was deep. An artery was involved. He would not have another hour without proper care. She looked around the room. On the wall was a first aid cabinet. She crossed to it and opened it. Inside she found gauze, tape, scissors, 2 elastic bandages, and a saline spray. She also found a cord attached to a small desk fan, which she unplugged and unwound. She worked fast. She packed the wound with gauze, applied firm pressure with both hands, then used the elastic bandage wrapped tightly above the wound, and tied it using the fan cord as a secondary compression point. It was not a proper tourniquet, but it was close enough to slow the bleed. "Keep your hand here," she told Marcus. Then she looked at the 2 young nurses. "You, sit beside him. Every 10 minutes, check if the bandage is soaked through. If it is, press more gauze on top and tell me." They nodded. Their hands were shaking. She looked directly at the one closest to her. "You can do this," she said. "I've seen you work. You're good." The young nurse straightened slightly and nodded again. Sandra then moved quietly around the room, kneeling beside each person, checking for injuries, checking for shock. The elderly visitor was trembling. Sandra held her hand for 30 seconds, not saying anything, just steady and present, and the woman's breathing slowed. She found a chair and placed it beside Marcus, where she could see both the wounded guard and the man by the window at the same time. The man in the gray jacket had not paid much attention to her. He was focused on his phone, on his demands, on the negotiators he was trying to call. This was something Sandra understood. People in crisis often focus on the thing they believe will save them and ignore the things happening around them. She used that. She kept her voice low when she spoke to the group. She organized them without making it look like organizing. She moved people slightly, repositioned them, so that the most frightened were near the calmest, so that the ones most likely to panic were closest to her. She gave everyone a small task. Hold this, pass that, watch this, because people in danger feel less afraid when they have something to do. When the man by the window raised his voice and began waving the firearm again, Sandra did not flinch. She did not look away, but she also did not stare. She held a neutral, watching expression that was neither challenging nor submissive. She had looked at people like this before, in places that had no walls and no doors and no first aid cabinet, with thin gauze and elastic bandages. 4 hours passed. At one point, one of the young nurses began to cry quietly. Her shoulders shook, and her breathing became fast and uneven. Sandra slid next to her and placed one hand on the back of the young woman's hand. "Breathe out slowly," Sandra said. "Longer than the breath in. Count to 5 on the out-breath." The young nurse looked at her. "Count with me," Sandra said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the time they reached 5, the crying had slowed. By the second count, the breathing had steadied. "There you go," Sandra said, and went back to watching the room. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the door came off its hinges. The SWAT team moved through the room in seconds. The man by the window did not resist. He seemed, by then, more exhausted than anything else. The firearm was secured, the room was cleared. Sandra stood up slowly, put her hands where the officers could see them, and then immediately returned to Marcus. "He needs a stretcher and a surgical team standing by," she told the first medic through the door. "Possible arterial damage, right thigh, improvised tourniquet in place for approximately 4 hours. He's been conscious the whole time." The medic looked at the tourniquet, then at her. She had already moved on to checking the elderly visitor's pulse. Outside, the freed hostages were wrapped in blankets and guided toward the parking lot where their families were waiting. Camera crews had gathered. People were crying and hugging. Sandra walked out with them, found a quiet place near the ambulance bay wall, and stood there, watching everyone else. She did not want to be interviewed. She did not want to be photographed. She was already thinking about whether Marcus would need a vascular surgeon and whether the 2 young nurses would be given enough support in the coming days, because she knew from experience that the fear did not always arrive during the event. Sometimes it waited and came later, in the dark, when everything was supposed to be fine. She was so focused on these thoughts that she did not notice the group of people watching her from the staging area near the command vehicles. They were law enforcement veterans, several of them former Marines, attached to the regional task force that had responded to the call. They had been watching the security footage from the administrative wing while the standoff was still in progress, tracking the situation inside the room through the camera mounted above the door. They had watched Sandra work. One of them, a tall man named Daniel Howe, a retired staff sergeant who had served with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, had gone very still about 20 minutes into watching the footage. He watched the way she wrapped the tourniquet. He watched the way she positioned the people in the room. He watched the way she stood when the man by the window raised his weapon, that completely still, completely calm, unafraid posture. He had seen that posture before. He had stood next to it, in another country, in another world entirely, many years ago. He turned to the man beside him and said, "I know who that is." He crossed the parking lot and found her standing alone by the ambulance bay wall, watching the crowd. "Doc Reyes," he said. She turned slowly. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not surprise exactly, more like a door opening that she had kept closed for a very long time. "Sergeant Howe," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You still owe me $20. She almost smiled. "You still owe me far more than that." The story came out slowly, in the days that followed, mostly because other people told it. Sandra herself gave one interview, short, and only because the hospital's director asked her to, because the story was spreading anyway, and it was better, the director said, for the truth to be told by her than invented by others. Her name had been Sandra Reyes. She had enlisted in the Navy after high school and trained as a hospital corpsman. She was then assigned to a Marine infantry battalion and deployed to Helmand Province, Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous regions during the height of the conflict. She served 2 full deployments. She treated hundreds of wounded. She saved lives in conditions that most people will never come close to and could never fully imagine. In 2012, during an ambush in a small farming district outside of Sangin, her unit came under heavy fire from 3 directions. 7 Marines were wounded within the first 4 minutes. Sandra moved through the open ground between them, reaching each one, working with whatever she had, keeping them breathing, keeping them stable, talking to them while the air above her was filled with the sound of incoming fire. She was awarded a commendation medal with a combat distinction. The citation used formal military language to describe what she had done, but the Marines who were there used different words. They called her the bravest person they had ever seen. They said she moved like she simply did not believe the danger applied to her, which was not quite true, but it was the impression she gave, and in that situation, the impression was what kept other people alive. She left the military in 2014. She went through a difficult few years. She changed her name after her marriage ended. She moved several times. She eventually got her nursing license and found a small hospital in a quiet part of Missouri that needed experienced hands, and she went there, and she worked, and she tried to leave the past in the past. She had not planned to be recognized. She had not planned to be anything other than a nurse who arrived at 6:47 and tied her hair back and checked the supply room before the shift started. But Daniel Howe had been watching footage of her for 4 hours before he said her name, and he had been absolutely certain the entire time. The other Marines and veterans on the task force came forward when they heard. Some had served near her. Some had only heard the stories. Some simply knew the name Doc Reyes, the way young soldiers know the names of people who did things that become part of the culture of a unit, passed from person to person, growing slightly in the telling, but always rooted in something real. They organized a small gathering at a local veterans hall 2 weeks after the incident. Sandra almost did not go. She sat in the back when she did, and she kept her jacket on like she might leave at any moment. Marcus, the security guard, came in on crutches. The surgery had gone well. He would recover fully. He stood at the front of the room on unsteady legs, and he said her name, and he said that he was alive because of what she had done, and that he would not forget it. Sandra stood when he said her name. She did not make a speech. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they accept something that they cannot argue with. Later, outside in the cool night air, Daniel Howe stood beside her, and they looked at the parking lot. "You could have told people," he said. "About what?" She said. "About who you are." She was quiet for a moment. "I am who I am," she said. "The rest is just history." He thought about that. A car passed on the road outside. Somewhere inside the hall, people were laughing. "Marcus is going to be fine," she said. "Yeah," Daniel said. "The 2 young nurses," she said. "Someone should check on them next week. Not just once, actually check." "I'll make sure someone does," he said. She nodded. She pulled her jacket tighter. She looked like she was about to say something else, but she didn't. She just stood there in the quiet for another moment, and then she said goodnight, and she walked to her car, and she drove away through the dark. She was back at work the following Monday. She arrived at 6:47. She hung her coat on the 3rd hook. She tied her hair back. She went to check the supply room before her shift began. The other nurses smiled when they saw her. She smiled back. And the day began.